On the 25th of September 1942, a man stood in front of officers of the British Army's Ordnance Board and fired 412 rounds from a weapon that had no stock and no sights. He fired from the hip. The weapon functioned. The board's report described its performance as satisfactory. The man was George Patchett. He was 40 years old, a motorcycle racer and engine engineer who had spent most of his adult life chasing speed records on Welsh beaches and building motorcycles for a Czech arms manufacturer in Prague. He had no formal training as a weapons designer. He worked out of a factory in Dagenham, Essex, for a company better known at that point for manufacturing electrical equipment and car parts than firearms. The weapon he had just fired had no name. It would eventually be called the Sterling. And the one thing that made it work, the single design decision that separated it from the gun it replaced, that earned it 40 years in British service, nearly 1 million units across dozens of countries, and the approval of special forces on 6 continents, was a pair of small rollers inside the magazine. Not the receiver, not the bolt. A pair of rollers about the size of your thumbnail that allowed dirt and grit to roll out of the feed path rather than accumulate against it and stop the gun from working. The Ordnance Board called it satisfactory that September. The British Army would not officially adopt it for another 11 years. Here is what happened in between and why the gun that survived that wait ended up being trusted enough to arm the SAS, equip both sides of a war in the South Atlantic, and end up in a galaxy far, far away. If you want to know how a motorcycle racer with no formal weapons training built the gun Britain trusted for 40 years, and why the Army made him wait 11 years before they'd admit it, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this one. George William Patchett was born December 23, 1901, in Nottingham. His formal education ended early, and his real education ran through engines. In the 1920s, he was racing motorcycles at Pendine Sands on the Welsh coast, a 7-mile stretch of firm, flat beach that had become the finest natural speedway in Britain, the same stretch of hard sand where Malcolm Campbell would chase land speed records in his Bluebird, and where Parry Thomas would die trying to beat him. Patchett was not chasing the land speed record. He was racing the Welsh TT on Brow Superior machines, winning in 1925 and again in 1927. In October 1926, he broke the short-distance speed record at Pendine, reaching 85.35 miles per hour. For a brief period, he held the motorcycle world speed record. What that career built in him was not glamour. It was diagnostic instinct, the ability to understand a machine by feeling what it did under load, to hear failure before it happened, to know which component was about to give way because you had felt 1,000 variations of the same stress. That instinct transferred cleanly to a drawing board. In 1930, Patchett was recruited by František Janáček, the Czech manufacturer who had founded the Jawa Motorcycle Company, to work as both engineer and racer in Prague. He spent nearly a decade there. When war broke out in 1939 and Patchett got out of Czechoslovakia, he reportedly threw prototype samples of Janáček's new anti-tank device over the wall of the British Embassy in Prague on his way to the border. He returned to Dagenham and joined the Sterling Armaments Company, officially the Sterling Engineering Company at that point, where he worked under George Lanchester, the automotive engineer overseeing production of the Lanchester submachine gun. The Lanchester was itself a copy of the German Bergmann MP-28, ordered into production in the desperate opening months of the war, alongside a far cheaper alternative that would define the next decade of British infantry experience, the Sten. The Sten needs a sentence of honest accounting before this story can proceed. Born from desperation after Dunkirk left the British Army without weapons, the Sten was brilliant at what it was designed to be: fast, cheap, and manufacturable by the millions. The basic Mark II version had 47 parts and cost $10 to produce in 1942. More than 4 million were eventually made. British troops called it the stench gun, which was affectionate the way soldiers are affectionate about things they rely on without quite trusting. The mechanism was sound. The magazine was not. A straight 32-round single-feed design with a flat-plate follower, it was the Sten's consistent, documented, widely hated weakness, prone to jamming under field conditions in ways that could not be trained or maintained away, because the failure was in the design, not the soldier. By 1942, Patchett had been given his own design team at Sterling with a specific brief: something better. The General Staff's specification was precise in the way military specifications always are after a war has clarified what precision costs. No more than 6 pounds, 9mm parabellum, rate of fire no higher than 500 rounds per minute. The brief of people who had watched the Sten's magazine fail them in the field and wanted the failure written out of the next design. Patchett's first demonstration: 412 rounds, no stock, no sights, fired from the hip, was on the 25th of September 1942. The Ordnance Board told him to add a stock and iron sights, and he did. The improved Patchett Mark I went through 1943 trials alongside the BSA Welgun and the Sten Mark II. Accuracy was flagged as a concern. The board said the design had potential. Sterling produced more examples. By late 1944, small numbers of Patchetts were reaching troops in the field, and one of them, serial number 078, now held by the Imperial War Museum, was carried in combat by Colonel Robert Dawson of No. 4 Commando during the attack on Walcheren in November 1944 as part of Operation Infatuate. The gun worked. The war ended, and with it, the urgency. The Army had warehouses full of Sten guns. There was no compelling institutional reason to replace a working weapon with a better one when the working one was already paid for. That calculus would govern the next 9 years of Patchett's life. The Sterling's blowback mechanism was not revolutionary. Open bolt, straight blowback, 9mm parabellum, the same basic architecture the Sten used, the same architecture most submachine guns of the era used. What Patchett had done was engineer every element around it to solve specific failures rather than accept them as the cost of simplicity. Start with the magazine. In May 1946, Patchett filed a patent for a new curved magazine design. The curve itself mattered. The slight taper of the 9mm parabellum round meant a curved magazine allowed cartridges to feed more reliably from alternating sides of a double-stack, double-feed arrangement. But the critical innovation was inside. Instead of a conventional flat-plate follower pressing cartridges upward into the feed lips, Patchett fitted 2 rollers. Those rollers contacted the cartridges at minimal surface area. Dirt and grit, the constant companions of any weapon used in the field, could not accumulate against a flat plate because there was no flat plate. The rollers let debris roll out of the feed path rather than building up against it. The gun fed because the mechanism of its feeding was designed around the conditions in which it would actually be used. The magazine could be fully disassembled without tools and was designed to be stamped from sheet metal and spot-welded, economical to produce, simple to clean, quick to service in the field. Every Sten magazine that had ever jammed in a British soldier's hands had been replaced by something that worked. By 1952, Patchett had added a pair of strengthening ribs to the inside of the magazine body, which further reduced friction on the rollers and allowed him to replace the oval follower spring with a more efficient circular one. The final production magazine held 34 rounds. Soldiers who had loaded Sten magazines found the Sterlings substantially easier to fill. Experts who have spent careers studying submachine gun design have called Patchett's magazine the finest SMG magazine ever made. That is a strong claim. The production record supports it. The bolt followed a different logic. Patchett cut helical grooves into the surface of the bolt, spiral channels that, as the bolt traveled forward and rearward through the receiver with each shot, scraped fouling and debris from the receiver walls and deposited it away from the working surfaces. The bolt cleaned the receiver as it cycled. The gun maintained its reliability, not by being sealed against the environment, but by working with it, actively moving contamination away from the surfaces where contamination caused failures. Paired with advanced primer ignition, the round fired a fraction of a second before the bolt reached full battery, while the bolt was still moving forward, so its forward momentum added to the cartridge's containment. This allowed a lighter bolt than simple blowback would have required. Two concentric recoil springs rather than one smoothed the cycling and reduced bolt bounce when cartridges chambered. The result was a controllable weapon. The rate of fire settled at 550 rounds per minute, slower than many contemporaries, deliberately. 2- and 3-round bursts were manageable with a trained trigger finger. The 6-pound weight, the side-mounted magazine that allowed a low prone profile, the pistol grip positioned at the weapon's point of balance. None of these were accidents. Each was a decision made about what the gun would feel like in the hands of a soldier who had been carrying it for 12 hours. The institutional path to adoption ran through a decade of trials anyway. 1947, inconclusive trials against the BSA design, an Enfield design, and an experimental Australian design. 1951, renewed trials against the BSA, the Madsen M50, and the Australian MCE M2. The Patchett was favored. Then delayed again when the Army considered whether the EM2 rifle, a British intermediate cartridge design intended to serve as a general-purpose weapon, would make the submachine gun role redundant. The EM2 was scrapped when NATO standardized on 7.62 by 51 mm, and political pressure from Washington obliged Britain to adopt the FNFAL as the L1A1 instead. The compact personal weapon requirement re-emerged immediately. Radio operators, medics, vehicle crews, mortar teams all needed something smaller than an SLR. The Patchett Mark II was officially adopted September 18, 1953, as the L2A1. 2 years of minor improvements produced the L2A2, then 10 days later, the L2A3, the Mark IV, the version that would be manufactured until the factory closed. The model changes between the L2A1 and L2A3 were minimal. The design Patchett had largely resolved by 1944 was the design the British Army would carry for the next 4 decades. Now consider what that actually meant over 40 years and across the world. Nearly 400,000 Lowell 2A3 submachine guns were manufactured between 1953 and 1988. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Fazakerley, near Liverpool, produced approximately 163,000 of them for British military use. Canada produced its own variant, the C1, through Canadian Arsenals Limited. India built the SAF Carbine 1A at the Kanpur Ordnance Factory, and India's ordnance factories manufacture a version of the Sterling to this day. Chile produced them through FAMEA. Across all licensed and derivative producers worldwide, total production is estimated at close to 1 million units. More than 70 nations purchased Sterling submachine guns. Argentina, Canada, India, Kenya, Lebanon, Libya, Malaysia, New Zealand, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Portugal, Singapore, Spain, Zimbabwe, 6 continents. The gun sold in a market where the Swedish Carl Gustaf M45 and the Israeli Uzi were its competitors, and it outsold both in terms of total national adoptions. The conflict record runs across more than 40 documented engagements. The Malayan Emergency, Korea, where 116 Patchetts were issued for troop trials before formal adoption. The Mau Mau Uprising, the Suez Crisis, the Aden Emergency, the Indonesian Confrontation, the Nigerian Civil War, Northern Ireland throughout the Troubles, the Falklands in 1982, where Sterling submachine guns were used by British and Argentine special forces simultaneously, on opposite sides of the same war, in the same South Atlantic wind, the Gulf War, the Iraq War. The suppressed variant, the L-34A1, adopted January 20, 1967, extended that reach into the specific operations that rarely appear in official records. Patchett designed it in 1964 at the Army's request. A ported barrel surrounded by a cylinder of expansion chambers, propellant gases bled through barrel ports before reaching the muzzle, entering chambers where they slowed and dispersed before exiting. Australian and New Zealand SAS regiments used the L-34A1 in Vietnam. The British SAS and Special Boat Service carried it through Northern Ireland and other deployments until the Heckler and Koch MP5SD replaced it in the 1980s. And then there is the version of this story that requires a brief digression into a galaxy far, far away. In 1977, production designer John Barry and the theatrical armorers Bapty and Company were equipping Imperial stormtroopers for a film called Star Wars. The budget was tight. The production was shooting in Britain. Bapty had access to current British military weapons, and the Sterling L-2A3 had a profile unlike any other firearm in production. Compact, angular, the side-mounted curved magazine pointing left at a distinctive angle. Fitted with a Second World War-era Sherman tank azimuth gun sight, black drawer runners sourced from a B&Q hardware store, and a cut-down magazine to suggest a power cell rather than an ammunition feed, the Sterling became the Blastech E11 blaster rifle, the standard weapon of the Imperial military. Luke Skywalker carried one. Han Solo carried one. Princess Leia carried one during the Death Star sequences. The gun designed in Dagenham for the British Army appeared in every film of the original trilogy, in the hands of the most recognizable soldiers in cinematic history. The roller follower Patchett had patented in 1946 ran through all of it. The British government, unwilling or unable to license his design directly, developed their own magazine, the L1A2, retaining the roller principle while making the body simpler to stamp from 2 pieces of steel rather than 4. Nearly 2 million of those magazines were produced at 4 separate British facilities across 4 decades. The principle Patchett had worked out in Dagenham went into nearly every magazine loaded into a British Sterling from adoption to withdrawal. The gun succeeded. The company failed. The man who designed it fought the government in court for 11 years. That is the part of this story most people who can describe the Sterling's bolt mechanism in detail have never heard. When the British government adopted the Patchett as the L2A1 in 1953, it contracted the Royal Ordnance Factory at Fazakerley to manufacture it without arranging payment to Sterling or Patchett for the patents. The Crown had legal authority to use patents in the national interest and determine compensation afterward. The Army exercised that authority and then did not pay. In 1955, George Patchett sued the Ministry of Defense. The case ran for over a decade. In June 1966, 13 years after adoption, while the gun was already in service across dozens of countries, the court found in his favor. Patchett was awarded £116,975. Sterling Engineering Company pursued a parallel action over the production license the government had imposed without agreement. According to James Edmiston, Sterling's later owner, the government settled out of court for £228,000. The court ordered Sterling be paid after finding the terms imposed on the company had been unfair. The legal history runs even further back and is stranger. The case known as Patchett versus Sterling Engineering Company, distinct from his later suit against the government, ran through the British courts in the early 1950s and reached the House of Lords. It was not Patchett against the Ministry of Defense. It was Patchett against his own employer. Sterling claimed ownership of all patents filed while Patchett was in their employ. Patchett argued the relevant inventions predated the employment contract or that the contract terms were in dispute. The House of Lords ruled largely in the company's favor. The patents belonged jointly to Patchett and Sterling, with the company holding the dominant interest. The case became significant enough in British employment law that it was cited by name in parliamentary debate over the Patents Employees Inventions Bill in 1965, legislation specifically designed to give employee inventors a clearer route to compensation than the Patchett case had provided. Put that sequence in order. Patchett designed the gun. His employer won a legal dispute giving the company dominant ownership of the patents. The government adopted the gun without paying for those patents. Patchett sued the government and won, 11 years later, £116,975. Sterling Engineering Company won $228,000 from a separate settlement. George Patchett died sometime before December 31st, 1974. No published record preserves what he thought about any of it. The gun that outlasted the Sten, survived 40 conflicts, armed both sides of a war in the South Atlantic, and became the weapon of the Imperial Stormtrooper, was designed by a man whose employer won a patent case against him, whose government adopted the design without paying for it, and whose 11 years in court produced an award bearing no meaningful relationship to what the weapon had become by the time he collected it. Return to Pendini Sands, October 1926. A 24-year-old reaches 85 miles per hour on a Welsh beach on a Bro Superior motorcycle. What that teaches you is not how fast you can go. It is what happens when something goes wrong at speed. Which component gives first, what the failure sounds like, where the stress concentrates. You learn to diagnose a machine by riding it. You learn to fix the specific thing that fails, not the general category of failure. That was Patchett's approach to the Sten. He did not redesign the submachine gun. He looked at the specific thing that failed, the flat-plate magazine follower that accumulated fouling and jammed the feed, and replaced it with something that could not fail the same way. 2 rollers instead of a plate. Grit rolls out. The gun feeds. The rest of his design choices followed the same logic. Helical bolt grooves scraping fouling from the receiver, a rate of fire slowed to what a trained soldier could actually control, a magazine designed to be stripped without tools in the field. Each decision the answer to a specific documented failure, not an exercise in improvement for its own sake. The institutions around him slowed that logic down at every step. 11 years from first demonstration to adoption. A government that manufactured the gun without paying for the patent. An employer that won ownership of his inventions in court. A company that held those patents until it went bankrupt in 1988. The same year the Army withdrew the L-2A3 from frontline service. The same year that closed the factory in Dagenham. And still, 40 conflicts, 70 nations, close to 1 million guns. The SAS, the SBS, Walcheren in 1944, and the Falklands in 1982. The Death Star and Mos Eisley. Nearly 2 million British magazines built on the principle of two rollers he patented in May 1946. Serial number 078 is in London now, in the Imperial War Museum. It is the Patchett that Colonel Dawson carried at Walcheren, the early version, before the roller follower, before the helical bolt grooves were fully refined. But the instinct that produced those things is already visible in the weapon. A man who understood failure modes by riding machines on beaches had looked at what the Army was carrying and seen, clearly and specifically, what needed to be fixed. He fixed it. 11 years later, the Army agreed. They named the gun after someone else.